So how are the best teams in the world playing at the moment? That's what I thought I'd have a little look at in this video ahead of the start of the World Cup. How are Ireland, France, New Zealand and South Africa playing? Because all their styles differ slightly. I've tried to look at the stats and find things to back this up. With some teams it was easier than with others, as you will tell. But that's generally what I'm looking at in this video. So make sure you drop a comment down below. Let me know what you make of it, what you make of the styles of these four sides. And also like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. That always helps with the algorithm and I'll massively appreciate it. But let's get into it. So what's the old boxing adage, styles make fights? Well, I think it's the same actually for this World Cup, and in particular for those top teams. They all have quite distinctive but quite different styles, which is going to make it even more fascinating for one, who can get out of that ridiculously tough side of the draw, and number two, who can get to the final and possibly even win it, presuming that most of us expect it to be one of these teams. So let's start off with Ireland, the number one team in the world, who over the last 2 years I think have absolutely deserved to be the number one side in the world based upon the results they've had. But they've built brilliantly over the last 4 years with Andy Farrell coming in to where their game is now. And they're good on both sides of the ball. I suppose to a degree, all of these sides are good defensively and in attack. It's why they're some of the best teams in the world. But Ireland, that's backed up in the stats. Starting with their defensive output, they're one of the best defensive teams if you look at how many points their opponents come away with per 22 entry. So for each time one of Ireland's opponents gets into their 22, gets into that red zone, Ireland are very good at keeping them out. It's 1.7 points that they come away with, which is really, really good. It's one of the best amongst tier one sides. I think it is the best amongst tier one sides. And the other thing with Ireland, I think, is they go really hard at your breakdown. They're averaging about 7 turnovers on average per game, which again is very, very high. And I think it's something we've seen with the provincial sides in Ireland in terms of how Leinster play over the last few years and how Ireland play. They go hard at your breakdown. They have the quality of players to be able to win turnovers, and they're a very tough side to break down and a tough side to score points against. We've seen that on a pretty consistent basis. But it's not just their defence. They have a very good attack as well. They gain more metres per match on average than any other tier one nation in 2023. They're scoring 2.7 points per 22 entry, which has them kind of level with France, South Africa, Scotland, a lot of very good attacking sides. So their attack has been very, very good as well. And a big part of that attack, I think, and something that got a lot of attention during the Six Nations, particularly towards the start of it, was the speed of that attack and the speed of Irish ruckball. And this speaks to the continuity in terms of their attacking shape. And when Ireland get going, they are absolutely brilliant. I remember watching the first test actually of their tour of New Zealand last year, when they actually lost that first test quite comfortably in the end. But I remember watching the first 15 or 20 minutes and just the shape of the Ireland's attack, the continuity in it, everyone on the same page, knowing what their jobs was, looked incredibly impressive. And I think that's something that has continued to be developed, and that's reflected in their ruck speed. Their average ruck speed for a whole game is at around just over 3 seconds, which is quick. 0 to 3 seconds is considered quick ball. Once they get into an opponent's half, then it drops below 3 seconds. They're able to attack quickly once they get the opportunities because everyone fits into that Irish system so well. So they've got a very good attack and they've got a very good defence. Let's get on to France, because I think they're a really interesting contrast, not just to Ireland, but to the other teams that I'll speak about in this video, in that I think this is a French team that don't particularly like having the ball too much. Their approach is to kick the ball away, but then strike when they get the opportunities. And if you look at their most recent game, it's quite a good example of this, that Australia had more possession and a lot more territory as well. Australia had about 60% of the territory, but the final score ended up being 41 points to 17 or whatever it was in favour of the French. So they kick it away a lot, but then they take their opportunities. I'll get onto that in just a second, because another big feature of this French team is actually accumulating a score. I think more than any other of the top teams at the moment, France take the 3 points when they're on offer. And we saw this against the Wallabies on Sunday. And when you've got Thomas Ramos, Melvin Jaminet, Matteo Jalabert, I think they've got a number of very reliable goal kickers in that team. The goal kicking overall percentage for the team this year is at about 88%, 90%. So they're kicking very regularly and kicking really well. And that means they can build a score. I saw Russ Petty, the statistician on Twitter, put out a stat that it was the last time that France were trailing at home. I can't remember the exact amount of games now. It was 30 or something like that. But it was a huge amount of games that France had been leading at half time. And that kind of game plan, actually, I wonder whether once you get to a knockout stage of a World Cup, could be very, very beneficial in terms of taking the score, not always trying to kick it into the corner, just taking the points on offer, chipping away at the scoreboard and keeping up scoreboard pressure. I think it's something that this French team is very, very good at. I suppose the flip side of the argument, just to play devil's advocate, is if this is a French team that have become so accustomed to leading at halftime, what happens in a big World Cup game or a knockout game on home soil where the pressure's on to win? What happens when you are then trailing? That's maybe something which some people might throw at me in the comments as well. But I mentioned that when they get the opportunity, they take it. 2.7 points per 22 entry, so they're looking at a similar level to Ireland there. And also a lot of their tries come from counter-attacks and turnover balls. So again, going back to what I said already, they kick the ball away quite a lot. They've got different kicking options on the pitch, whether it be Jalabert, Dupont, Ramos, Jaminet if he's starting. Even some of the wingers aren't too bad with putting boot to ball, so they kick the ball away a lot. But when the opportunities arise, whether it be on turnover ball, whether it be on the counter-attack, this French team are able to take them, partly because of the quality they have. You look at Damien Penaud as one example, one of the best wings in the world at the moment, and the stats back that up. So France, that's why I think they're really interesting, because I think they have such a distinct style, maybe compared to some of the other teams. I'll move on to South Africa and New Zealand. Full disclosure on this, it was harder for me to be able to find as many consistent stats about them, in particular for New Zealand, because they haven't been playing Northern Hemisphere sides in their warm-up games. It made it a lot more difficult, but I've made a few observations from the Rugby Championship. I'll get onto them in just a sec and start off with the Springboks, because they've added to their game. We've spoken about that a lot on the channel, but they do still have a backbone of, I suppose, what you would consider traditional Springbok rugby. They're incredibly physical, they have a good defence, and they have an excellent set piece. And that's also actually reflected in the way in which they've carried the ball and the amount of times they've carried the ball as well. Because prior to their match against Wales, and I can't imagine that this stat would have dropped down much since that Wales game and since the game against the All Blacks, because the Springboks were so dominant in those games. They had the highest carry dominance of any Tier 1 nation and the highest gain line dominance as well. So I think they still have that platform to be able to get those big ball carries and get, not even just the big ball carries, the more elusive, the athletes in that back line up over the gain line and the athletes in their forward pack, quite frankly. Their scrum success rate is really, really high. Their line-out success is really high as well. And that scored a lot of tries for them, particularly the line-out and the driving maul. And interestingly, with South Africa, they score a lot of their points in the second half, which, I don't know, sometimes it's hard to read too much into various different statistical columns. I just wonder whether that is a reflection of the Springboks being able to grind a team down. They score more of their tries, they score more of their points in 2023 in the second half of matches, which depends how you look at it. Could be a good thing, could be a positive. But I think finishing a game strongly is always something that the best teams in the world do. And as I've said already, Libbok, Moody, Arendse, the offloading game for South Africa is something that they have absolutely developed as well. So the attacking game has developed as well as those more traditional strengths of South African rugby. But I think, as we saw against the All Blacks at Twickenham, they're tracking really, really nicely. Now let's finish it off with New Zealand. I'll be honest, this has been harder for me, as I've said already, just because of the stats. You know, with France, I was able to get a really good picture of probably how they play. With New Zealand, it was a little bit more difficult. So All Blacks fans, do drop a comment down below to add or to correct anything I say here. Obviously, putting the game against South Africa most recently to one side, because they were so blown away. They lost all areas of the game, whether it be the set piece, whether it be carry dominance, discipline, all those areas. So if we look at the Rugby Championship, I think a big reason for New Zealand's far better start to 2023 than what we saw them produce in 2022 has been an improved scrum and line out. I know those were two areas that were decimated against the Springboks most recently, but I still think overall, from what we saw in the matches in the Rugby Championship, there's something for New Zealand fans to feel positive about there. Also, just another observation, the consistency in their halfback pairing of Aaron Smith and Richie Mwanga. I would imagine amongst Tier 1 nations heading into the World Cup, there won't be too many that have as consistent a pairing as that. France might have been close until Untamak got injured, so now Jalabert's come in. But I think they have two guys there in for the All Blacks who are very comfortable with running the type of attack that they want to implement, essentially. Elsewhere, in terms of the All Blacks, some interesting stuff when they're not obviously playing against the Springboks at Twickenham. The amount of phases, passes and offloads that they went through in the Rugby Championship was basically always higher than their opponents, which I suppose gets me to the crux of how I think New Zealand are playing. Is I think they're quite happy to have the ball, almost the opposite to France in a way. And it's not that New Zealand don't kick it away. They do. In fact, you look at that Springbok game in the Rugby Championship, the aerial game and the kicking game was absolutely pivotal for the way in which New Zealand played. And that was an area they were able to get dominance. But they do like to play it. They like to offload it. They like to get the ball through the hands. And I think they will look to hurt teams in that way rather than just trying to build pressure in the way that France do. It's why it's so interesting. It's why I wanted to do this video, is because of those different styles. So I think New Zealand want more of the ball. I don't think they're completely backing their defence. It's not that their defence can't be very, very good, but I don't think they're one of those teams that give the ball to their opponents and back their defence to turn them over or win penalties. I think they're quite happy to play with it when they get the opportunity, and they're happy to try and have more of the ball, which goes in contrast to some of the other teams that we talk about. So apologies again that maybe for the Springboks in New Zealand, it was a little more vague. It was about what I could get my hands on, really. But I still think there's a very interesting discussion to be had here about how teams play. Styles make fights, and I think the World Cup is going to be a fascinating fight for these four teams, who gets out of the group, and also maybe who ends up winning the competition overall. Add anything you want to in the comment section. I look forward to reading them. Like the video, subscribe to the channel as well, and I'll see you in the next one.